All right, guys, so we're going to learn how to code this roller coaster app. That's going to help me find the least speed, height, and length, and the greatest speed, height, length, and number of inversion of roller coasters. And these are all things that we figured out we had access to in our data set if you watched the earlier videos. So first thing I need to make sure I do, if we haven't already done it, or if you're just following along from this point using the skeleton in the link, you can go to the Data tab, and this is important. Go to Science. So this is where our roller coasters is under. And then click Roller Coasters. So Data tab, Science, Roller Coasters, and make sure you import the data set. You have to do that if you remix or make a remix of someone else's code. You have to re-import their data set. Okay, so now that we have this in here, I'm just going to click on it so we can see what we have access to. And I did talk about this in earlier videos, but I have access to roller coaster names, the amusement park it's in, the city it's in, the country, the region, construction material, height, speed, length, and number of inversions, as well as whether or not it has inversions and what year it's open. And we can get the data from each of these columns using getColumn. So let's go back to our code. And we're going to, now that we've imported our data sets, we have access to it, we need to actually bring it into our program. So let's start by going to variables. And we're going to define some global variables. So I'm just going to start with one here. So we're going to var, and let's call this the coaster names. And because this is going to be in a list, or what's called an array, same thing, it's going to store multiple of those same things. So it's always good coding to use a pluralized name, like coaster names with an S at the end. So anytime you're doing lists or arrays, name them as a pluralized version. So what do we want to store this as? We've defined it, and we're going to give it an assignment. And to do that, we need to go to the Data tab, and we use getColumn. And if you notice here, it gives you the syntax. We need to tell it what table to get our data set from, and then what column to import. So to do that, we can click these little downwards triangles. So the first one is which table. It's our data set roller coasters. And then for coaster names, when I choose the column, I want the roller coaster name. Perfect. And if I want to make sure that this is importing properly, I can add to my watcher down here. It might be easier to just copy and paste. So click once, Control C or Command C, and then paste, Control V or Command V if you're on a Mac. So right now it's undefined. My program's not running. But when we press run, we give it a second, we can see it actually did just import all of the roller coaster names as a list or an array that has 257 different coasters. Okay, beautiful. Now I do want to do that for, I think, 8 different pieces of data for this app. So to make our lives easier, I'm going to cheat a little bit and break out of block mode here to text mode. That's just because it's easier to copy and paste similar code. So I'm going to copy again, Command C or Control C, and paste, Command V or Control V, until I have 8 of these. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe whoops, one more. Okay, and now I can go back to block mode. So we're going to change this from coaster names. Some of the other things I want is the park names. And it is from the same data set, but I need to change which column it's importing. And so for this, we're going to do amusement park. I also want the cities, again, pluralized name, same data set, but the column I want is city. I want countries. So let's change the data set to country. What else did we want in there? We wanted like the lengths. So I want the length. Speeds. That's speed. Heights, which is height. And then we want number of inversions. The number of inversions. There we go. These are the 8 different columns And if you want, you could add them to your watcher list, but I believe we're good at importing all of these. It's just letting me know they're defined, but we haven't used them yet in our program, and that's true. Okay, so the next thing we're going to need to do, we're going to skip past this area for other global variables. We're going to try to keep them all global for the most part in this app, and maybe I'll talk about why later. Okay, so we need some on events just to make our buttons work. So let's add these in now. These are hopefully easy, and hopefully you've had some practice with these. So we're going to add in the on event. And I have 3 screens in this app. We have the home screen, which we're on. When they click the greatest button, I want it to navigate to the greatest screen. And when they click the greatest home button, I want it to take me back to the home screen. And similar with the least button should take me to the least screen. And the least home button should bring me back to the home screen. So we're just going to program that functionality. So we're going to drag in an on event. So we need to tell it which item we're interacting with. So in this case, when the user clicks the least button, again, you can see all my elements have nice meaningful names here. And I want when they click that button, so on this event, we want it to run this function. And what we want it to do is change the screen. And we do that through set screen. That's in UI controls all the way down at the bottom. And the screen we want to change it to is the least screen. Okay, so we could also use this one as a quick copy and paste. There are a total of 4 buttons. So I'm going to text mode, copy and paste a few more times here. All right, I thought my recording stopped. So when they click the greatest button, so when the greatest button is clicked, we want to set the screen to the greatest screen. And when the user clicks the greatest home button, I want to set the screen back to the home screen. And similarly, when they click the least home button, so it's the home button on the least screen, I want that to take me back to the home screen. So I can reset my app here. Let's just check that our buttons are working. It's always good to test as you program. So I'm going to click least. We're on the least screen. Beautiful. And home takes me back home. Greatest to the greatest screen. And home takes me back home. So far, my on events are working exactly as I intended them. So perfect. Next, I do want, though, when the user gets to the least screen, have a drop-down, and I want it to execute my code when the user changes their selection here. They pick speed, height, or length, and I want it to tell them which roller coaster has the least speed, height, or length. So these are also going to be on events. So on event, and this is called the least drop down. So it's the drop down on my least screen, least drop down. Not as clicked this time though. I want this to execute when the drop down has been changed. So only when the user changes the drop down to execute this code. And what I want it to do is call a function that's going to find the roller coaster with the least speed, least height, or least length. So it's going to be calling another function. So I'm going to go to the Functions tab and just tell it to call a function. And we haven't written this function yet, but let's give it a name that describes what it does. Let's call it find least. Okay, so it's trying to call some function. We haven't written it yet, but we're going to write this function next, find least. Okay, down at the very bottom, I've given you a part here that talks about finding the least value. And so let's write our function down here. So we need to name it with that matching name, find least. And what I want my function to do is, first, I need to figure out which of these options the user has selected. And we can do that by, in this case, we're going to keep all of our variables global. So I'm going to go back up in this area that I gave you to put in other global variables. And let's call this selection. And we can give it an initial assignment of just a blank string. So just some empty quotes with nothing between them. Okay, you could also just define it without giving it a value, I like to assign the data type, like if it's a string or a number, and give it a default value. Okay, so what I want to do is, when the user runs this code, I want to update selection. And I can update it by getting the text in the dropdown, the currently selected text. So we have under UI controls, get text. And the text I want to get is from the least dropdown. So I'm going to add to my watcher, and this will work because it's a global variable. The watcher will not work if it's a local variable. So if you define selection inside of the least function, like used a var in here, it will not show up in the watcher. And that's because that variable is created and then destroyed, or essentially gone away, so fast that it will look like it never changed. But let's reset the app. We're going to go to the least screen, and I'm going to change the dropdown to say speed. And I can see, yep, my selection variable now has speed with a capital S, or height with a capital H, or length with a capital L. Perfect, it's updating. Now, unfortunately, it also might say select a measurement. Might have to code around that later. Okay, so what do I want it to do now? I've got their selection. I want it to go through my list and figure out what the smallest value is. So the problem here, though, is there's 3 different lists. So we first need to say, like, hey, if the variable or the selection is speed, let's say. So we need to write an if statement. So let's go to control. We're going to start off with an if statement, and this is going to be after we've gotten the selection, because we need to know what the selection is first. Remember, code in my function runs top to bottom. So if, and let's check equivalence, which I think is under variables. No, math. It's under math. Sorry, I don't block code too often. So I want to check if 2 things are equal. Use double equal signs for that. So if selection equals, let's say speed, and it does need to have capital S. It needs to match exactly as my dropdown does. So if that's true, I want to use the list speed, right? That array that we imported earlier called speeds. So one thing I can do here is we're going to create one more global variable. So coming back up here to where you define selection, we're going to create another variable, and we're going to call it the list to reduce. Finding a maximum or minimum value is called reducing the list. And I'm just going to assign it as an empty array. So just put those open and close square brackets. And one of the things that we can do is say, hey, if the selection is equal to speed, let's update our variable. So we're going to use the variable, the x equals blank one here. Let's update list to reduce should equal the speeds list from above. Now we're going to repeat that. I'm going to go to text mode really quick so it's a little easier to copy and paste this if block, just pressing enter in between. So if selection, though, equals height, I want it to use the heights array that we imported. And if it's equal to length, then I want it to use the lengths. Oh my gosh. There we go, lengths array. And then we can also program around if they accidentally select a measurement, right? We'll talk about that later. But let's try this. I'm going to type in list to reduce. And again, because it's a global variable, I'm going to reset my program and run it. Let's go to the least screen. Notice, by the way, sometimes it'll take a second to load in. That's because it's loading the data set. So it takes a second for sometimes those buttons to be functional. So let's change it to one of these. If I change it to speed, these are all the values that are the speeds corresponding to my coasters. These are the heights I changed it to height. I can now see that list to reduce has changed values. And lengths, these are the lengths of my roller coaster. Okay, so it looks like it's updating list to reduce with the correct list based on my selection. Coding looks good so far. So now I need to write the function to find the minimum. Now let's create two more global variables here. Let's do var min. And you know what? Let's just use the generic without an assignment here. Let's create a min variable. Let's create a max variable. So we're actually going to update them in our function. And max we'll come back to later, but let's write the one for min. Okay, so we need to write a for loop. But to find the minimum value, the first thing we do is assume. So I just dragged in the for loop block here, which we'll edit in a second. We need to assume that the first piece of data in our list is the smallest. So to do that, whoops, I don't want the var key. Sorry, this is already defined. We want to assign the min value to the first item in list to reduce. So it would be like assuming 190 here is the smallest value for length. So we do that by doing, and this is from, gosh, I couldn't tell you which one this is under. And so you guys that block code more are probably screaming at me right now. There we go. It's not list index 0, but list to reduce index 0. Okay, so get the first element, which remember in JavaScript is index 0. Okay, for my for loop, we're going to start with I equals 0, I less than list to reduce dot length. So list to reduce dot length, increase I. As long as I is less than the last element of our list, we can go on to the next one. And I here is going to correspond to kind of the rows from our data set. So this would actually be technically row 0. Because remember we start at 0 arrays. This would be row 1, row 2, row 3, etc. Okay, so what we want to do is say an if statement in here. This takes us through, it's going to go over every individual item. And we need to check, is the current value greater than is our new value, the current one we're looking at, smaller than our current minimum? So we need an if statement. We're going to say if, there we go, if, we're going to use the less than symbol here, if list to reduce index I, and I apologize, I should have grabbed a block like this. Okay, it updated to it though. List to reduce index I is less than our minimum. Okay, so if it is less than our minimum, we need to update the minimum value. So minimum equals list to reduce index I. List to reduce index I. I'm just going to copy. Can I copy and paste? Not quite. List to reduce index I. So if the current row we're looking at's value is less than the current minimum, then we have a new smaller value. Let's update minimum to that new value. Okay, perfect. Now what I'm going to do at the end here, when this is finished, or I guess we can just log the min value. It's a global variable. Let's see if this works. We're going to reset the app, go to least, give it a second to load in the data set, and let's select speed. 9.72, and I believe this is in kilometers per hour. That sounds like a small speed. Could be the smallest piece of data in that data set. The least height, this is in meters, so 3 meters, not a very tall coaster. But it's now gone through the heights and found the smallest value. And length, 60 meters, that's a pretty short roller coaster. That seems like it could be the minimum value. So I think it's finding the correct minimum value. So far, so good. When we go to find max later, it's going to be very similar, except what we're checking for here is if my item is greater than the maximum, update the maximum. Only difference there between finding the smallest and largest values. Okay, it's changing just this if statement's inequality direction, and of course using the variable max. Okay, well, what do I want to do with this? I want to update the text over here. So to do that, we're going to need to create a string. So we can have a update string. Let's call this output string. Okay, so once my for loop is done and we found the min value, we're going to want to update our string. So this is after the for loop, but still in my function. Output string is equal to, and what do I want to put in here? It's going to be a lot of stuff. So I think in my output I had the roller coaster name, which is a variable. So that was, and you'll have to forgive me, I'm going to do some typing in here. So remember, first string, double quotes. Actually, I want the variable first. And you know what? We need to grab all those values. We haven't done that yet. We haven't told it to get the park name that has the 60-meter length roller coaster, etc. So let's create these global variables where we're going to store all those things. So we're going to need one for the park name, singular this time, and I'm just making it a blank string. What is this? Park name, coaster name. You can also just give it a blank string. We need the city. I need the country. These are all things that I wanted to include in my output string. You can make yours less detailed if you want. Now, I don't need to do length, speed or height, because I can just use the value from min. Like min will give me the length I want to put in my output string. So we can just use min there. And what else did I need in there? We don't need number of inversions for this. We're going to do that for greatest. So I think this is it. That's all the different ones we need. Let's get that out of there. Okay, so what I want to happen, though, is if I update this, and I can already see where we're going to have a problem, but let's do this right now. Once I update the minimum, let's also update the park name. Park name should equal the park names at index I. So like the current row that has the new smallest value, let's use the park name that matches that row, right? So say if this was well, here's my least height right here. My least height, I want it to grab the park name from that same row, which is index I. So get that park name from park names index I and store it. Let's get the coaster name from coaster names index I. Let's update the city. It's getting a little laggy there. City from cities index I. These are these arrays that we used get column for from earlier. Do I want the country? And I'm using singular to store these single values from countries index I. And I think that might have been it, right? Yeah, park name, coaster name, city, country. Perfect. Okay, so now, by the way, I can do park name, coaster name, city, country. It's all lowercase. So I have some more watchers here. So let's reset our program and see. It's going to take a second here. If I select, let's say, length. So let's see, what was the one we had in here? Oh, we had the least height, right? I think was this first one. Least length, though, that seems right. And we could check through our data set that this is the name of the park, the odd name of the coaster, etc. And this is in Germany. Oh, we didn't finish this, so we're getting an error. Let's just give it a blank string for now. We can fix that. One of the things we're going to have a problem with, though, is like height. Note, it did find the least height was 3, but my park name, coaster name, city, and country are all blank. And that's because when we look back in here, the least height was actually the very first one in my data set. So to account for that, right? If we never had to update list to reduce, we never updated the park name, coaster name, city, or country. So it never updated to anything but blank. So what we need to do is also, I'm going to do text mode just to copy and paste. These 4, copy. For my for loop, by the way, if you want to tab these backwards, it's Shift Tab. And we're going to store the park name from park names index 0, the coaster name from index 0, the cities from index 0, and the countries from index 0. Sorry, I guess I could have done that in block mode. But instead of I, and this is before the for loop, we're just going to say, hey, if the minimum value is the first one, then let's use the park name of the first one, the coaster name of the first one, the city and country of the first one, etc. And only if we find something smaller do we need to update those values with the new row's values, right? Okay, so this looks good. What do I want my output string to say? And I am going to type most of this because this is where blocks really kind of fail us. For our output string, I want it to be the coaster name. And this plus sign, remember, means concatenation. So we're not really adding, we're just combining. Coaster name, space. I think at, I'm trying to remember what I put in here, at. And then let's do the park name with a plus sign to concatenate. So coaster name at park name. Always put a space after your variable, so inside of your strings, so they're not all crammed up together with no spaces. So park name in, and then this is going to be the city, comma, country, has the least, and then we can actually use here, I almost forgot my space, as the least, we're going to use, we can actually use the selection to say whether or not that was the, downsize this toolbox so we can see what's going on here. Has the least selection, so it's going to say least height or speed, whatever the selection has been updated to. At, and then we're going to use minimum. Okay, so this should be my output string, and I'm going to get rid of all the rest of this. Let's put output string here. So let's reset. Let's see if this is working. I change it to speed. Ooh, it's a long string. Doesn't want to go to multiple lines for me. And look at how crazy this looks in block mode. Look at all this concatenate. Like, it looks insane. This is where, and even going back to text mode, this looks way better. One of the other things you can do, especially if it's hard to read your thing here, one, I can just set my text to this area, which I'm going to want to do anyway. So maybe let's just do that. All right, we'll go back to block mode. So let's set the text, this crazy string. Let's go back to, whoops, I need my toolbox back. So click the little arrow. So let's set the text. That's under UI control. Set text. Where are you at? Set text. Oh, it's towards the top because it's used pretty common. Set the text. And on that least screen, this is called the least text output. Least text output. And I don't want to use the literal string text. I want to actually assign it what we have in our variable above, output string. So it should put all of that text in here for us to see it. So let's run our program. Let's do speed. Junior Gemini at Cedar Point in Sandusky, USA. And I can see I need a space here. Space. Has the least speed at 9.2. Now, 9.72 what, right? Might a user ask, like, what is that? Is that miles per hour? What units are we talking? So if you're not sure in your data set, there's a button that says more info. And in fact, it doesn't tell me in the columns what these correspond to, what units they are. But if you click more info, it'll actually tell you about each of these columns. And I'll zoom in a little bit. So for instance, for height, that's the height of the roller coaster in meters. Speed is kilometers per hour, and length is meters. It also tells you what data type they are, like numbers or strings, etc. So that's pretty nice. I've got my units. Height and length are meters. Speed is kilometers per hour. So how can I dynamically, zoom back out here, do that in my code? Well, let's create another global variable. And we got a lot of these. Let's call it units. And let's just make it a blank string. And now we have this global variable. We're going to change units depending on what their selection is. So say they selected speed. I want units to be the string meters. No, speed, sorry, was kilometers per hour. Okay. If it was height, I want it to be meters. So let's say units is equal to the string meters. So that's what I want it to say in my string. And by the way, since these are at the end of our sentences, we can put in the periods here as well. That'll just give us less to add on to that string later. Since it's the last thing in our sentence. And lastly, let's do update units. If they chose length, my units is also meters. And yeah, there's some redundancy here, but I think we're okay. So let's reset and run this again. We're going to go to least, speed. Oh, we didn't update our string, right? Let's come back to this insane concatenated string. I'm going to go to text mode and cheat a little bit. And I'm just going to put plus a space and then plus units at the end. And I just want a space between the number and units, so it reads a little nicer. But now let's try it. So go to least speed, and it now says least speed at 9.72 kilometers per hour. And if you don't care about the S and speed being capitalized, you're good. You're good to go. We don't really have to do anything else here in particular. I might have added in these here. Now, if you want to make sure that this is a lowercase s, there is a way of doing that, which is, let's say once we get to this point, we can change selection by doing selection dot, oops, I'm not in block mode. I apologize, guys. Let me go back. Do this in block mode. After my for loop, we can change selection before it gets to the output string. And we can do that by using dot to lowercase. Check this out. So I need to say, we're going to update a variable. Let's use this. And selection is going to equal, where was it? There it is. The string selection, but dot to lowercase takes this string and forces all of the characters to be their lowercase versions. And once we change this to be all the lowercase versions of selection, let's store that new updated variable in selection. So the only thing we should see difference now is the speed here is lowercase. I know this is a little extra. You don't have to go that crazy for the most part. But let's see. Go to least, change it to speed, and now I have a lowercase s. I love it. It's beautiful. This works perfect for our height. The least height at 3 meters. We can double check this in your data set that these are the correct values. And there's our least length. Beautiful. Okay, now to write the function that's going to find the maximum, it's going to be very similar. And so here's again where text mode shines. Let's copy almost this entire, in fact, the entire function, find least. And above it, we're going to paste. And we're going to change this instead of the find least button. We're going to change this one to find greatest. You can say find most, I guess. I would find greatest since I've talked about greatest screen, etc. So find greatest. So let's see. I want to get the selection when the user calls find greatest. But before I get too ahead of myself, let's create the on event for that too. So we also need the on event when the user changes the greatest dropdown. The greatest dropdown is changed. Let's go to the function. Let's have it call the function find greatest. Okay, and we just started writing find greatest. It's mostly written for us. We do need to edit some stuff. So first, we need to make sure that the selection we're getting is from the new dropdown, which is the greatest dropdown. So we're going to be on the greatest screen. If the selection is speed, height, or length, however, on the greatest screen, we also have number of inversions. So I need an extra if statement in here. So let's see. What if, we're going to check for equivalence again. What if selection is equal to number of inversions? I think that's the correct capitalization. Yes, O of lowercase, but N and I capitalized, number of inversions. Okay, well, we need to, very similarly, update our list to reduce. I'm going to cheat a little bit again by copying from one of these. We can just do the one right above. Copy. Now let's paste in here. So we want to update the list to reduce to be the number of inversions. That's the array that matches way up above. Num inversions. Oh, I have num of inversions. Sorry, let's change that to, actually, that's fine. We'll leave it as num of, so we don't have to worry about going back. Let's just make sure it matches down here. Find greatest. This should be num of inversions. And the units here are, I guess, inversions for my units. So instead of finding min, though, we're actually finding the max. And just like with the minimum, we assume it's the first one in our list. We still want to update the park name, coaster name, city, and country. But here we need to change this math block, and that's actually going to be easier using text. So I can change this to the greater than, just changing the direction of the inequality just in the if statement. Don't change the one in the for statement. If the current value we're looking at is greater than the max, then we need to update the max, not the minimum. So update max. With that current value, that park name, that coaster name, that city, that country, all of this is going to work the same. We can take the selection and make it lowercase so it reads a little bit nicer. I like that. My output string is going to mostly be the same. I'm going to go to text mode so it doesn't look quite as crazy. But instead of least, let's say greatest. And then where we want to set that text is not the least text output. That would be on the other page. We want this to go on the greatest text output. So we do have to be careful when you do copy and pasting because you have a lot of similar code. to make sure you really go through with a fine-tooth comb and make sure you change all of the things that need to be updated. But let's check out if this is working. I know this is a long video. We go to greatest. Let's do speed. Uh-oh, undefined kilometers per hour. Well, let's see. If lister size greater than max, update max. Assume max is the largest value. Oh, you see, this is where I was just talking about. I know exactly where it is. It's in my string. And that's because the variable we didn't update over here is the max. We wanted to display the max value, not the variable minimum, which had nothing in it. That was why it was undefined. It actually found the right coaster. Let's go to greatest. Speed, 194 kilometers per hour at Top Thrill in Cedar Point, Sandusky, USA. Interesting. What about height? That looks correct. Length, that's a pretty long coaster right there. That seems reasonable. And number of inversions, and I believe this is actually, you can check the data set here, that the Hapohari, the name of the coaster, I guess, is actually unknown. So that's missing from their data set. That is not an error in our code, I promise you. Might take a while to search through and find it, but you could look through it and find the Haro Hapi park. And anyway, the roller coaster name is itself unknown. So that's part of the data set, but we've coded it beautifully. Now, I do have skeletons here for comments. You'd want to comment all of these things. This extra function, I guess we actually didn't need. I'll remove that from the skeleton. And we can get rid of some of these extra spaces. It's just a little bit easier to do in text mode. And that's it. That's my timer. It says get off. Anyway, I hope that helps. Thank you guys for sticking around if you did. I know this is a very long video, but hopefully walking you through all of that and showing you where text mode, can make things a little bit easier, hopefully helps out. Thank you guys. Good luck with the rest of your projects.